There are Jewish stories that sound like a prayer. There are stories that sound like exile. But the story of the mountain Jews sounds different. In it, prayers are spoken against the backdrop of mountain roads, Persian speech blends with Caucasian intonations, and the memory of an ancient people lives among fortresses, bazaars, vineyards, and courtyards, where the honor of a family was sometimes defended with more than words. Who are they? Where did they come from? Why is their language related to the Iranian languages, while their religion connects them to Jerusalem? Why did Soviet documents sometimes try to classify them not as Jews, but as Tats? And how did a people scattered across the Caucasus, Israel, Moscow, and New York continue to recognize themselves through just a few words of the language once spoken at home? Before this story begins to unfold, support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel. Subjects like this rarely stand at the center of grand historical narratives. Yet it is precisely from such stories that genuine memory is formed, not simplified, not convenient, but alive. To understand the mountain Jews, one must first see the Caucasus as something more than a postcard. It is not only white mountain peaks, towers, music, and dance. For centuries, the Caucasus was a crossroads of empires, religions, and trade routes. Armies and caravans passed through it. The interests of Persia, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire collided here. People speaking dozens of languages and practicing Islam, Christianity, and Judaism lived side by side. The distance between two settlements might appear small on a map, yet feel enormous in reality. A gorge, a mountain pass, a winter road, a foreign authority, an unfamiliar custom. For a small community, this landscape was both a refuge and a trial. The mountains could protect people from persecutors, but they could also cut them off from the great centers of Jewish learning. Living alongside other peoples made it possible to trade, learn crafts, and adopt local clothing, music, and traditions of hospitality. Yet it also forced the community to answer the same question every day. What could be accepted from the surrounding world, and what must never be lost under any circumstances? This is where the first word of our story appears: the dagger. Not as a call to violence, not as an attempt to turn every mountain Jew into a legendary warrior. Here, the dagger is part of the language of the Caucasus. It symbolizes adult responsibility, a man's reputation, the ability to defend one's home, and the refusal to be treated as a helpless outsider. Imperial and later ethnographic accounts often viewed the mountain Jews through ready-made clichés. Some writers wanted to see them as untouched Jews from the Bible. Others portrayed them as Asiatics who had almost completely dissolved into their surroundings. Modern researchers warn that both images are far too simplistic. The mountain Jews were not a museum mystery, nor did they exist outside history. For centuries, they participated in the life of the Eastern Caucasus while remaining part of the wider Jewish world. Much of their outward culture was Caucasian: clothing, music, hospitality, respect for elders, and the importance of family reputation. But influence from the surrounding world did not mean disappearance. The community assumed the shape of the place in which it lived, while preserving its inner core. Mountain Jews worked in trade, crafts, agriculture, and horticulture. In different regions, they cultivated grapes, tobacco, and rice, raised silkworms, and processed leather. In the towns, they worked as craftsmen and merchants. The image of an exclusively warlike people is just as inaccurate as the image of Jews concerned only with books. Their lives did not depend on a single occupation or a single type of character. They depended on the ability to adapt to the economy of each particular place. The dagger matters here as a metaphor. Anti-Semitic caricatures often portrayed the Jew as weak and incapable of resistance. The history of the mountain Jews destroys this stereotype, not through the claim that everyone carried weapons, but through a particular model of behavior. Security depended on relationships with neighbors, the reputation of the family, the ability to negotiate, and the willingness to stand up for one's home. But while the dagger explains the external world, the origins of the Mountain Jews lead us deeper into the Persian shadow. When exactly did Jews first appear in the Eastern Caucasus? There is no single date that can be carved into stone. Ancient traditions survive within the community's collective memory. Some connect the ancestors of the Mountain Jews to the exile of the 10 tribes of Israel after the Assyrian conquest. Others trace their history to the destruction of the First Temple. These legends matter as expressions of a people's memory of antiquity, but they cannot be presented as a proven chronology. Historians are more cautious. They generally connect the formation of the community to the Jewish population of the Iranian world and to centuries of migration from Persia into the eastern and northern Caucasus. This was probably not one single migration, but a long process unfolding across many centuries.
The clearest witness to that connection is the language. It is called Juhuri, or Judeo-Tat. It is an Iranian language related to the Tat varieties of the Eastern Caucasus and historically connected to the Persian linguistic world. But Juhuri is not merely corrupted Persian, nor can it be explained entirely as the result of living among neighboring peoples. It developed within a Jewish community, absorbing Hebrew and Aramaic elements and, later, influences from Azerbaijani and Russian. Its speakers call themselves Juhuro, meaning simply Jews. Imagine a family kitchen in Derbent at the end of the 19th century. Different languages can be heard in the street. At the bazaar, a merchant must understand his trading partner. In government offices, Russian is increasingly required. Hebrew words are heard in religious life. But at home, a mother speaks to her child in Juhuri. The language becomes more than a means of conversation. It becomes a home that can be carried from one place to another. In 1888, Ilya Sherebetovich Anisimov, himself a member of the Mountain Jewish community, published his work, The Caucasian Mountain Jews, in Moscow. He was one of the first members of the community to attempt to describe its life, customs, and language, not as an outside observer, but from within. His work requires critical reading today. 19th century ethnography often used categories that modern scholars consider overly simplistic. But Anisimov himself remains important. A people that had always been described by others had begun to speak in its own voice. Then came the Russian Empire. After the wars with Persia in the early 19th century, a significant part of the Eastern Caucasus came under the rule of St. Petersburg. The imperial bureaucracy began classifying the inhabitants, assigning them official names and defining their rights and obligations. It was in this context that the Russian term Mountain Jews became established, distinguishing them from the Ashkenazi Jews of the empire. But an official name did not create a people. It merely placed an ancient and complex community inside a new administrative category. For some, incorporation into the empire opened new roads and markets and created opportunities to learn Russian. For others, it brought taxation, military conscription, disputes over land, and dependence on a new authority. The centers of communal life changed. After the Russian conquest, Derbent became one of the most important spiritual and cultural centers of the Mountain Jews. Communities emerged or expanded in Baku, Grozny, Temir Khan Shura, Nauchik, and other cities. Yet neither an imperial official, nor a neighbor, nor a traveler could fully understand the Mountain Jews by looking only at their clothing and language, because the second word of this story is the Torah. Not necessarily a scroll displayed in every home. Here, the Torah represents the inner order of life, the Sabbath, circumcision, the laws of marriage and burial, festivals, food, names, blessings. The synagogue was a place where the community did more than pray. It settled disputes, educated children, and remembered its connection to other Jews, even when the nearest major center of Jewish learning was very far away. On the outside, a man might resemble any other Caucasian Highlander.
He might speak Azerbaijani or another local language with his neighbor, conduct official business in Russian, and speak Juhuri at home. But inside the synagogue, the direction of prayer, the reading of the Torah, and the Jewish calendar connected him to a people scattered from Morocco to Bukhara, from Yemen to Warsaw. That was the boundary. Not a stone wall, not a complete absence of cultural exchange. It was a system of repeated actions through which a child came to understand that the family lived in the Caucasus, but that its history neither began there nor ended in that courtyard. The religious life of the mountain Jews developed its own forms. Their communities had rabbis, teachers, ritual slaughterers, and religious judges. The synagogue served as the center of both prayer and education. At the same time, local traditions differed from those of the Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe and from those of Georgian Jews. The mountain Jews cannot be confused with either group simply because they all lived within the borders of the same enormous empire. These communities had different languages, historical paths, and cultural environments. This distinction is especially important because mainstream history long viewed Jews primarily through a European lens. When many people heard the word Jew, they imagined a shtetl, the Yiddish language, or a Polish or Russian city. But the Jewish world was always much broader. It included Persian, Bukharan, Georgian, Yemenite, Kurdish, and mountain Jewish traditions. The mountain Jews were not an unusual exception within Jewish history. They were one of its complete and integral branches. And yet it was precisely their connection to the surrounding culture that would later give the authorities a dangerous instrument. If these Jews looked similar to their neighbors, if their language was Iranian, and if their clothing was Caucasian, perhaps they could simply be declared not Jewish at all? After the revolution, the Soviet authorities promised to develop the national cultures of the various peoples. At the same time, they began a campaign against religion and independent communal life. For the mountain Jews, the first decades of Soviet rule became a time of paradox. On the one hand, Juhuri gained schools, newspapers, and literature. On June 3, 1928, the newspaper Zakhmetkesh, The Worker, began publication in Makhachkala. Writers and poets appeared. Plays were staged. Textbooks were published. A language that had previously been heard mainly at home, in the marketplace and in the synagogue school, entered Soviet public life. But the price of that public recognition was high. The Soviet system wanted national culture to exist without independent religion, without connections to Jews abroad, and without the right to define its own memory. Jewish tradition was expected to become folklore. The synagogue was expected to give way to a workers' club or a warehouse. The rabbi was expected to disappear from public life. Hebrew script was expected to become a suspicious relic of the past. The history of the Juhuri alphabet makes this transformation almost physically visible. The language was originally written using Hebrew letters. In 1929, it was transferred to the Latin alphabet. In 1938, the Latin alphabet was replaced by Cyrillic. Within a single generation, a person could see the same family language written in 3 different scripts. This was not merely a technical reform. Each change pushed younger readers further away from the old manuscripts, prayer texts, and books preserved by their ancestors. We have now reached the middle of this story. If you have already sensed how much more complicated this subject is than the familiar stereotypes, write in the comments whether you had ever heard of the Juhuri language before. Support the video with a like and subscribe so that forgotten pages of Jewish history can return to the wider conversation. Synagogues were closed. Religious education weakened. Schools gradually switched to Russian. After the war, Juhuri was increasingly pushed out of education and official culture. People still spoke it in their homes. They still sang in it at weddings. The elders still told their stories. But children might already answer their parents in Russian. This is how a language begins to disappear. Not with a ban on speaking it. It begins when studying in that language becomes inconvenient. Publishing in it becomes difficult. Building a career through it becomes impossible, and explaining to a young person why it is still needed becomes harder with every passing year. The Soviet policy toward language was accompanied by a struggle over names. In official classifications, mountain Jews were often associated with the Tats, the Iranian-speaking population of the Caucasus. The linguistic relationship was real, but the authorities attempted to use it as proof that mountain Jews had no Jewish national connection. Beginning especially in the 1960s, a policy sometimes described as Tatization was promoted in parts of Soviet Dagestan. Mountain Jews were encouraged to register themselves as Tats and to present their ancestry as non-Jewish. Researchers emphasize that the subject remains sensitive because language, Soviet nationality policy, and personal identity became deeply entangled. Tatization did not always require a person to denounce their ancestors publicly. Sometimes it merely changed one word on a form. 20 years later, a grandson might no longer understand why his grandfather had called himself a Jew when the official document said something else. But the Torah, as an inner boundary, did not disappear completely. Families continued to circumcise their sons, marry within the community, bury their dead according to Jewish custom, celebrate festivals, and preserve certain prayers and prohibitions. Sometimes a person could no longer explain the religious meaning of a ritual, but still knew one thing: this is what our parents did. Under Soviet secularization, those words, "this is what our parents did," became the final thread. Then came the war, and the question of who the mountain Jews were ceased to be bureaucratic. It became a question of life and death. In the autumn of 1942, German forces entered the northern Caucasus. Nazi policy was directed towards the extermination of the Jews, but the occupation authorities encountered a group they did not fully understand. The mountain Jews spoke an Iranian language and were culturally and outwardly close to their Caucasian neighbors, yet they practiced rabbinic Judaism. Nazi officials and racial experts began debating whether they should be considered Jews under Nazi racial pacifications. This debate was not an expression of humanity. It was merely a pause within the machinery of murder. But in some places there was no pause. In August and September of 1942, German units murdered hundreds of mountain Jews in the settlements of Bogdanovka and Menzhinskoye. Researcher Kirill Pfefferman gives a combined figure of approximately 850 people murdered in these two actions. This must be remembered because the comforting legend that the mountain Jews were not recognized as Jews and were therefore saved conceals the reality. Where Nazi forces made their decision without hesitation, mountain Jews were murdered as Jews. In Nauchik, the situation unfolded differently. The occupation lasted from late October 1942 until early January 1943. Mountain Jews were robbed, registered, and sent to perform humiliating forced labor. Some were murdered. However, community leaders, local neighbors, and representatives of the Kavardian population participated in attempts to convince the occupation authorities that the mountain Jews were a local Caucasian group rather than people whom the Nazis classified as racial Jews. While officials debated and gathered information, the Red Army liberated the city. Most of the community survived. Historians emphasize that their survival cannot be explained by a single trick. It resulted from a combination of communal self-organization, assistance from surrounding populations, contradictions within the occupation system, and the relatively brief duration of the occupation. This reveals a terrible irony. The Soviet authorities could tell the mountain Jews, "You are not entirely Jewish, you are Tats." The Nazi authorities asked, "Are you Jewish enough to be murdered?" But the people themselves had known the answer long before either system appeared. They knew who their parents were. They knew where the synagogue stood. They knew how a prayer sounded. They knew how the dead were buried. They knew which words were spoken to a child at birth. An identity that empires attempted to measure through questionnaires or racial examinations lived in everyday actions. After the war, Soviet silence returned. It was not the same as the terror of Nazi occupation, and the two regimes must not be confused. but the consequences for religious and linguistic memory were severe. Younger generations increasingly switched to Russian or Azerbaijani. Juhuri survived in families, songs, literature, and short radio broadcasts, but it gradually became the language of the elderly. Modern linguists classify it as vulnerable or endangered. After emigration, it found itself overshadowed by Russian, Hebrew, and English. And now the third word appears: the mystery. Not in the sense of a secret ritual, not in the sense of a closed tribe. The true mystery of the Mountain Jews is much more ordinary, and therefore more powerful. How did a community survive among different states, languages, and religions without a single capital of its own, and while living for centuries far from the main centers of the Jewish world? One answer can be found in Krasnaya Sloboda. On the northern bank of the Judeo-Tat River, opposite the Azerbaijani city of Kuba, stands a settlement known today as Krasnaya Sloboda, or Kermiza Kasaba. It was established in the middle of the 18th century under the protection of the Kuba Khanate and became one of the largest centers of mountain Jewish life. It had neighborhoods, synagogues, workshops, trade, and family courtyards. The settlement was not a mythical island existing outside politics. It endured wars, changes of government, Soviet anti-religious campaigns, and mass emigration. Yet its Jewish character survived. Krasnaya Sloboda is important not because it can be advertised as the last Jewish shtetl. The European word shtetl does not fully describe the reality of the Caucasus. It is important as a rare example of a place where mountain Jews were not merely a small street inside someone else's city, but the majority population of their own settlement. Here, the outer and inner worlds came together with particular clarity. Across the bridge stood Kuba, a Muslim city, with its marketplace, administration, neighbors, and business connections. On the other bank stood Jewish homes, synagogues, a cemetery, family lineages, and the Juhuri language. This was not isolation. It was coexistence, with a boundary the community knew how to preserve. The Museum of Mountain Jews now operates in the former Khashoggi synagogue. The building survived the Soviet period, when it was closed and used for non-religious purposes, before eventually being restored as a place of memory. Its collection includes household objects, documents, photographs, religious books, clothing, and testimonies to the life of the community. The museum does not prove that time can be turned backwards. It demonstrates something else. What was once considered too local and insignificant deserves its own hall within the history of the Jewish world. The streets of Krasnaya Sloboda have grown quieter. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many mountain Jews departed. Some went to Israel, others moved to Moscow and other Russian cities. Still others went to the United States, especially New York. Emigration brought security, new opportunities, and closer connections to the wider Jewish world. At the same time, it disrupted the language's natural environment. As long as a family lives in the same courtyard as the grandmother, Juhuri is spoken naturally. When children grow up in Israel, their school speaks to them in Hebrew. When they grow up in Moscow, the street speaks Russian. When they grow up in New York, it speaks English. At that point, the language must no longer simply be remembered. It must be consciously saved. Studies of mountain Jewish families in Israel reveal a typical pattern of language shift. The older generation speaks Juhuri fluently. The middle generation understands it, but more often replies in Russian or Hebrew. The youngest generation may know only a few words, the names of traditional dishes, terms used for relatives, and family jokes. The language is still alive, but it is transmitted naturally less and less often. That is why dictionaries, language courses, digital projects, song recordings, and new educational spaces are being created, places where young descendants can hear not only a translation, but the voice of their own family. The disappearance of a language almost never looks like a catastrophe that happens in a single day. No one enters the house and takes all the words away. One day, a grandson simply fails to understand his grandfather's joke. Later, he can no longer read an old inscription on the back of a photograph. Then a family song is left without an accurate translation. And one foundational later, a person knows that he is a mounting Jew, but can no longer hear a living language within that name. And yet the story does not end with disappearance. Community organizations exist in Israel, Russia, Azerbaijan, and the United States. Books are published, music is recorded, cultural gatherings are held. Juhuri is taught as a rare Jewish language, including in academic programs. Krasnaya Sloboda remains a place to which families return, not always to live. Sometimes they return to show their children the ancestral home, the cemetery, the synagogue, the river and the bridge. A person sees a family name carved into stone, hears a familiar melody, and understands that the Caucasian part of the family does not contradict the Jewish part, and that the Jewish part does not erase the Caucasian one. That is what was hidden between the Dagger and the Torah. Not division, complexity. Mountain Jews could adopt Caucasian codes of honor while preserving Jewish law. They could speak an Iranian language and pray in Hebrew. They could live among Muslim and Christian peoples, sharing melodies, dishes, and gestures of respect, while still remaining a distinct community. They could be Soviet citizens, serve in the military, and become doctors, engineers, performers, and teachers, while preserving at home a ritual the state dismissed as a relic of the past. Their history teaches caution. Jewish identity cannot be defined by European clothing, the Yiddish language, or a family name. Language cannot be treated as proof that someone actually belongs to a different people. Cultural similarity cannot be turned into a denial of identity. And the dagger must not be romanticized as though dignity were measured by weapons. The dignity of the Mountain Jews revealed itself primarily in something else. In their ability to live beside powerful cultures without turning coexistence into hostility, to adopt what was useful without surrendering their memory, to survive changes of empires, alphabets, and borders without losing the name Yuhuro, Jews. What is most important to carry away from this story? The Mountain Jews are a distinct historical Jewish community of the eastern and northern Caucasus. They are identical neither to Georgian Jews nor to the Ashkenazi Jews of the region. Their language, Juhuri, belongs to the Iranian language family, and irrespective of Jewish religious vocabulary and centuries of Caucasian coexistence. Their origins are connected to the Iranian-Persian Jewish world. However, the precise chronology of their earliest history remains a subject of research, meaning that the legend of the lost tribes cannot be presented as an established fact. During the Soviet period, Juhuri passed through Hebrew, Latin, and Cyrillic writing systems, while religion and communal autonomy came under pressure. Krasnaya Sloboda became one of the principal symbols of preserved mountain Jewish life. Modern dispersal, meanwhile, has transformed the language and family memory into a heritage that must now be passed on consciously. Now, let us return to the table. The dagger is still lying on the left. The Torah is on the right. Between them is a family photograph. At first, it seemed as though these objects were arguing with one another. But that conflict was invented by an outside gaze that demands every person choose only one category, either Caucasian or Jewish, either a man of mountain honor or a man of the book. But life rarely obeys such simple formulas. The Mountain Jews did not become a mystery because they concealed themselves. They became a mystery because mainstream history too often did not know where to place them. Between Persia and the Caucasus, between the synagogue and the mountain courtyard, between Juhuri and prayer in Hebrew, between the dagger and the Torah. And perhaps it was precisely there, between those worlds, that they managed to preserve themselves. If you watched until the end, write the code word Juhuri in the comments. Let that word be spoken once again, not as a label in a museum, but as the living name of a language and a memory. Support the video with a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who are accustomed to imagining Jewish history as a single road. Because names return for as long as they are spoken.